through a VPN. Does it FaceTime? Oh, okay, VPN and FaceTime, okay. Other than sending them to me, right? Okay, yeah, okay, cool. I will answer that question when we get to services, and I'll make sure I jump into those things you're talking about, Christy, and I'm happy to talk through it with everybody. Okay, so great.
Let me ask the one more thing.
Yeah.
Related to the question you were just at first dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, when you're talking about this parity for telehealth,
Mm-hmm.
prior to this uh, pandemic, I mean, there may have been parity, and maybe I just don't know. But the impression that I had was the rules around using telehealth, if I guess if someone else was going to pay for it, right, you can do anything you want when it comes to somebody who will pay you out of pocket. But
Right.
the rules for all the insurance companies were so complicated. You had to go to a specific place, and the person had to be also in a specific place. And I did not have
Oh,
any
in Medicare, for
clarity
Medicare.
at all.
For Medicare, yes. And I'll actually describe that. Actually, thanks. I will then, I'm actually about to get to a thing where we describe that.
Great.
And I will call you out and be like, hey, this is what I'm talking about. Okay. Yeah. And Medicare currently doesn't do that, but it looks like they're going to do that again, which is a shame. Okay. All right. So, okay, cool. Thanks, everyone. This helps me know what you all want to know about. I really appreciate it. Okay. So telemental health. During the COVID emergency, it seemed like the big term that emerged in the public consciousness was teletherapy. So I've been saying teletherapy a lot. But in fact, there are, I think Jay Ostrowski did a quick survey and found like 32 different terms used by different licensing boards of different professions to describe the idea of doing psychotherapy or counseling remotely. And so that was interesting. So telemental health is kind of the emerging term for talking about mental health care. You could also say telebehavioral health if you identify as doing behavioral health. And certainly there's a term telepsychology. The APA has specific guidelines for telepsychology. If you've never seen those, check them out. I actually recommend them to all the professions. They're good guidelines. And they're not too directive while still being helpful. And those are from 2013. And the guidelines, by the way, they're not a code of ethics or any type of rules. So you're not required to follow them, but they are very helpful. The Oregon Psychology Board's social media committee also has published some guidance, and I was on that committee. And I know that that committee is primarily focused on media, but it does have, certainly my contribution to that had more to do with security and security of information. So if you're also interested in knowing more about that, note that the licensing board itself has guidance. And that can help you see what the licensing board will expect out of you. But that will mostly relate to your presence online and to how you secure information, like electronic information. Okay, so here I want to talk about just the basic conundrum of teletherapy or telehealth, so we can be in the same place. And so that I want to teach you all the kind of conceptual model I use when I think about telehealth as a medium. And the word medium is part of that model. So just here in a second, I'll explain it. I have a bunch of little things that, like, if I have a longer presentation, I'll spend more time kind of indulging in it. But here, I think probably this audience will understand what I'm talking about very quickly, especially after the last year. So here's the way I like to frame this model, this way of thinking about tele. And I'm just going to say tele just to mean whatever we mean. This is just remote, right? So if I just say tele, I mean tele, whatever you want to put after the word tele, right? So when we are classically trained for what I call sitting in a room talking to people, right? The sitting in a room talking to people modality, or sorry, medium, excuse me, not a modality, excuse me, medium, right? And we have a variety of modalities we use there. Personally, my main modality is internal family systems. That's the main one. I'm otherwise rather humanistic, psychodynamic, like you might say. Another person would be cognitive behavioral therapy, be a heavy part of what they do. There's all kinds of EMDR. We have all these different modalities, but the medium is the context in which we do it, right? And the classic medium we're trained for in grad school is sit in a room and talk to people. Now, that's what I call it, right? There's probably a better word, but I like putting it that way to be very specific about what I mean. Also, to be very particular about pointing out that sit in a room and talking to people is itself a medium. However, we think of it as being the medium, mostly. And so one thing I want to offer to you is to try on thinking about it as just another medium. You know, sitting in a room talking to people is just one way to do your modality, to deliver your modality, to deliver your skills, to deliver your services. It might be the best way, depending on your modality and the services you offer and your style and your client's needs. By the way, I'll say clients, that also means patients. They're interchangeable, right? So like that's the thing I want to consider. And so when we are in a room talking to people, here's a really important aspect of that medium that I want you to make conscious if you haven't already, which is if I'm in a room talking to people, if that's my medium, that means I pick the room. Like very importantly, I pick the room. I'm the one who sets up a room for us to sit and talk in, right? And so what that means is that everything about the environment of the therapy and the physical context in which it occurs is something I designed, right? So I'm actually doing this from home, but if I was at my office, I could show you over there is the room at the door that people enter from the waiting room. Here's a sofa that they very obviously sit on because of just how the room's designed. Clearly that's where they sit. And there's the exit door, all by design, right? Now, when you're doing tele, a big thing we often focus on, quite rightly, is the tech part, you know, because it's a big deal. And like, it's something that can have all kinds of little fiddly bits that we need to work with, right? And that's all very important. But of course, I think a thing that we want to make sure we think about is that we are no longer working in a space of our design, right? Especially when when we're doing what's called direct to client, which is what I know Dr. Rog was asking about, which I'll explain in a second. But direct to client means the client is setting up their space entirely on their own. And I would love for you to consider how many of your clients really know how to set up a therapy space, right? And how often have you ever done home visits? Right? Some of you may have done home visits. That might be something you're used to. I find I get much more head nods on that one when I'm talking to social workers, for example. They're a lot more likely to have done a lot of home visits work. You know, psychologists, I think it's, you know, it's more higher variety there actually. But like, if you think about a home visit and what's different about that, some of that comes in when you're working with tele, especially when it's direct to client, because often you are in their home, or if you're not in their home, you're in their car or wherever they are, right? So the thing to consider here is you don't get to set up things. You have to respond to what the client sets up, which means you have to help the client do it right, and you have to be flexible. You have to help the client do it right, and you have to be flexible. And I find that's one of the biggest things a lot of my colleagues struggle with is kind of figuring out that line between the client isn't doing this thing right, I need to insist, such as how they dress, or like, are they sitting on their bed during therapy versus sitting in a chair? These are things a lot of people have talked about having concerns about. It's very much, in my opinion, it's not something you can generically say. You can't generically say clients shouldn't be lying on their bed for their session, or clients shouldn't be wearing pajamas, or clients shouldn't be eating. Like, these are things that I don't think you can generically define in a policy sense. Although, I mean, some clinicians will, and that's fine because that's how they do their practice, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. But when you're talking about the fact that we're going into the person's home or into their context, you know, trying to get them to recreate what we would do in our room where we sit and talk to them may or may not actually be successful, right? And on top of that, there's also all these responsibilities you have that you know how to do here in Portland or whatever part of Oregon you're in, or Oregon in general. But if the client isn't in the same municipality as you, like, how do you call 911 if they have an emergency? Because if you literally call 911, you're going to get the switchboard for where you are, not where they are, right? Like, do you know the direct line to call 911? Do you know how, like, a mandatory report works where they are? I mean, usually it's often state level, so it'll be the same, right? But what about crisis lines? What are the local, if they become hospitalized, what are the local hospitals? If you figure, oh, if there's an emergency, I'll just call the police. But they're in a rural area, there are no police, it's the sheriff's office. You know, these are all kinds of things to that you want to be aware of, that they all change. And in my opinion, I think you can base the need for extensive research on just the needs of the client. I don't think it's something you have to do with every single client. But, you know, if a client has more likelihood of decompensation, or just, you know, part of their condition is that they may need someone to come help them, right? How do you arrange that? Like, do you arrange for a special helper? And if not, if you figure you can rely on emergency services, do you know that for sure? What are the emergency services where that client is? How long does it take for a first responder to get to them? You know, these are the kinds of things that we don't really think about when it's our own room because we know all these things. You know, if it's our own room, it's all set up, right? When it's someone else's room, it changes from client to client. And so there's a need for a little more research. There is, and this is an important bit, there's an increased need to enroll the client in their own care. There's an increased need to enroll the client in their own care. That is going to be across the board true when you're doing tele. And I'm going to tell you, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like in a lot of cases, there's actually a big bonus to that. You just have to adjust to the medium being different from what you were trained for in grad school. And you may or may not have experience with professionally. Okay, so some of the contextual stuff, context. So this is what Dr. Ra was talking about. So there are two kind of contexts here which have large differences. One is called clinic to clinic, and the other is called direct to client, right? And so clinic to clinic, before COVID, Medicare would only do clinic to clinic, right? And so Dr. Al, that's what you were asking about, I believe. So clinic to clinic means that you're in your space where you do things. It could actually be your home office, but we still call it clinic, right? And then the client goes to a clinical spot. They go to a place where there's a provider who sets up a telehealth space for them. With Medicare, that would generally be like a Medicare, Medicare calls it the hub and spoke model, where there's like a clinical center that's the hub, and then you're one of the spokes, which is out in the remote area, who kind of pipes in through telehealth to help them with things. And so the idea is that someone would go to this Medicare covered facility, usually in a rural area, because it has to have that special need under Medicare. And then they'll have a room that's like the telehealth room, and then you work with them in there. You have probably been doing all direct to client, unless you've been working with Medicare. Probably throughout COVID, you've been doing all direct to client, which means you haven't done clinic to clinic at all. If you're like most of my colleagues, you've never done a clinic to clinic context, which is where it's super different when you do, because the person's in a room that was set up for them to do telehealth in. It becomes a little bit more like your, sit in a room and talk to people in the sense that it's designed. It may not be your design though, but it is designed. And there are often qualified, competent healthcare staff nearby who you can call. Like you can actually contact them directly and say, the client is having a seizure because they suddenly had a seizure, or my client is decompensating and they need help. Like these kinds of things are there. And so you can already imagine that some conditions become better indicated for telehealth when you have clinic to clinic versus direct to client. So for example, somebody with a psychosis that has a technology theme to the psychosis, that's one of the areas we go, let's be real cautious with telehealth, right? Because that could be very disturbing for that person. However, I also have worked with colleagues who specialize in CBT for psychosis, who certainly do so by video all the time, and they talk about ways of handling that. But you can definitely imagine that for that client, a clinic to clinic context might be a good idea, because it might be easier to manage the risks of decompensation or other things you need to worry about with that client if you know they're in a context where they can get care immediately, right? Direct to client is where you just connect directly with the client wherever they are, wherever they can set up. And that's the vast majority of what we've got. So they're often called CTC or DTC, direct to client being DTC. Sometimes we joke that DTC stands for direct to car, because so many people do therapy in their car because it's the only private space they got. Especially if they're trying to do their session in the middle of the workday. But of course, that was more true before COVID, before everyone was working from home. So yeah, this I think this is the answer to your question, Dr. Rob. Basically, if you're working with Medicare before COVID, they required clinic to clinic. You are not allowed to do direct to client. They are doing direct to client now. There are currently bills running through Congress that may or may not keep the direct to client allowance for Medicare, or may not. All the private insurers, I've never seen a private insurer require clinic to clinic. I've only ever seen them just say telehealth, whatever context. They don't usually define the context. So medium there's several medium for tele, but we're gonna talk about video because that's the one we're used to. Also, a lot of the reason why we're so interested in the video medium is that a lot of the early research, or the early accepted research, I should say, on behavioral health, telemental health, comes from the early aughts, and it's heavily researched that's funded by Medicare, right? And so the Medicare research is really focused on video. Why are they focused on video? because video is sort of seen as functionally equivalent to our classical training of sit in a room and talk to someone. Right? The idea is that really what we're trying to hedge bets by getting both video and audio in an effort to make it more functionally equivalent. Now, after a year of this, I'm sure most of you are probably on the same page with me that just because you have video and audio doesn't make it functionally equivalent. In fact, some of you may have discovered the beauty of phone sessions over the past year, if you hadn't already. There's a lot, there's a lot more information now about Zoom fatigue or the difficulty of doing a Zoom session because of the extra cognitive overhead that comes from trying to interact via video conferencing. Also, there are certain anxiety-inducing things for some clients, such as knowing they're on camera or seeing themselves. That also can be very exhausting for therapists to see themselves in the picture-in-picture all day. Actually, it's exhausting for everybody because everyone's doing it at work too. Right? There's a lot of confounders that, in my opinion, make it look like, well, video is not really a functional equivalent. Like the idea that we can just fire up the Zoom and do what we always do and nothing's different is definitely false. However, the assumption is that it's closer than any other medium, which could be phone only, which means it's just audio, there's no video. It could be textual, which means like email or secure email or texting, or there's avatar, which is definitely a very growing area, but certainly not anywhere near functionally equivalent to what we're used to. Which is where the therapist and client take on virtual avatars in a virtual world and interact with each other to do therapy. And there's a lot of research on avatar therapy from the Department of Defense as part of treatment for PTSD, and that's very promising. Also, if you're really into play therapy or Jungian therapy or anything that's heavily relies on imagination as part of therapy, you might want to look into avatar because there's a lot of possibility there. Okay. Trusted authorities, of course, your board, that's your main authority pretty much all the time. Then your ethics code. The APA Code of Ethics is very clear that everything in the ethics code applies to all contexts or all medium, I think any medium, all mediums, right? Any medium, including digital media. And then just generally says, so your ethics don't change, which I actually think I agree with quite a bit. But my understanding is that the ethics code is currently under revision, and I'm sure we'll see more direct information about tech in the new APA ethics code. The American Telemedicine Association is the place I would say to turn to for the easily accessible research on telehealth that is very, very research-based and very usable. And in fact, pretty much all of my citations in this presentation come from the American Telemedicine Association's 2009 guideline on telehealth by video, or telemental health by video, sorry, and also the 2013 guideline on telemental health by video. Unfortunately, now you have to be a member of the ATA to get those documents. They used to be publicly available. But if you join the ATA, you can get those documents. Although I have noticed that some other people have been posting copies of those documents around, but that's not necessarily academically honest to do, right? But if you're also looking for a huge amount of fantastic, valuable free resources, look no further than the telehealth resource centers. If you just look for telehealth resource centers, you'll find them. These are publicly funded organization that just provides tons of resources to people doing telehealth, including telemental or telebehavioral health. And there are regional ones. So there's a Northwest Regional Telehealth Resource Center. So you can get more locally focused information and help. So if you're, basically, I know some of you are saying you're looking into being kind of seriously hanging a shingle doing telehealth, go right to the telehealth resource centers and find out what you can learn there. Lots of great materials, they're all free. Okay, so like I said, the American Telemedicine Association is a primary source of my citations. And that's because their guidelines are based on meta-analysis of hundreds of other studies, which, as we know, is the strongest research type. So, all right, that said, okay, we're gonna talk about law and ethics. These are basic topics around law and ethics that you wanna think about. And before I get into this, I wanna point out that we did send over to share with you this document, which is our big checklist. It's about 25 pages of checklists. It's essentially kind of the textbook for our telehealth certification program that we do. So I sent it over so that you can get something that's basically just a thorough starter And you can go through it and be like, okay, these are all the things I need to make sure I cover in some way or another. It makes more sense along with training, but it is usable all by itself, like absolutely, right? And it covers lots of stuff. So the reason I want to pull this out is that in the presentation, I'm not going to put a lot of details on the screen. So your slides that you get won't have a lot of details, but you will get those details from the checklists. So if you don't have the checklist right now, I'm sure Jeff or someone else from the conference will make sure you get them, and you can use those to fill in the information. Okay, so help me out here, Prezi. Okay, okay. All right, ethics, informed consent. I know some of you are asking about tech choice and cross-border, and I want to focus on those. So, which means I'm not going to put a lot of time in the informed consent, because as you can probably guess, informed consent is a big topic, because that is always true, right? The one thing I will say is you do need some specialized informed consent specifically for doing tele. There are new items involved where you need to have the person consent and be informed of. The question that often arises there is, should I have a separate informed consent from my basic informed consent, like a normal one and then a telehealth one, or should I combine them? I think it will depend on how your practice runs. Like if telehealth is sort of an add-on to help people have access, then I would make it separate. If you're focused on telehealth or focused on a hybrid, then you don't have to make them separate. But I personally, in my opinion, just from my experience, I would mark in your informed consent which portions relate to telehealth. I'd be like, oh, here's the telehealth related stuff, because the stuff that's related to telehealth can certainly feel like it applies in person, but it's useful for clients to understand, yeah, when you're in my office and we're talking to each other face to face, these things don't necessarily apply. Some of them are obvious, like you need to inform them of the risks and benefits of using the software that you use, the fact that it can cut out in the middle and things of that nature. The two things I want to make sure I highlight, because they aren't necessarily obvious and not everyone necessarily covers them, is one, a real simple one, is make sure your informed consent addresses your policy on recording sessions. Because the basic stance for standard of care is that we don't record sessions. That's the basic stance, is that we don't record sessions. And we strongly urge clients not to record their sessions. Now, of course, there are times when recording is appropriate, such as when you have supervision, or you want to record for your consultation group. Those contexts, it's the same largely as when you're doing in person. You need the client's consent and et cetera, and be thoughtful about recordings. But the big thing really we're looking at there is it's very important to cover with the client that if they decide to just use a screen capture software, which you can't see, like you don't know they're using it, right? And they're using this to record their session, it's really good to at least talk to them before you start about some of the consequences of that. Make sure clients understand that that's not something we recommend they do. And in fact, if they did do that, we would really much prefer they tell us, because it's good manners, if nothing else, to let people know when you're recording them, right? So that's the thing I want to make sure y'all hear. Like, recording it's a thing. So make sure you talk about it from the beginning, because clients may decide that they just fire up the QuickTime screen capture while they got their session. Why not? Right? What's wrong with that? What are the risks? It's really good to tell them up front, this is a thing we should talk about before you do that. The other thing is another standard of care for telehealth, and I actually think this is a standard across the board, but this is me and my opinions about how things should be, is we do need to be monitoring continuously the client's appropriateness for the medium we use. And so this is why I talk about the word medium as being important. Like, is there appropriateness for video conferencing, or if we're going to do textual-based remote therapy, we definitely want to be monitoring their appropriateness for that. Especially because it's harder to monitor their state when we're only getting textual information from them. Whatever we're doing, whatever the context, we need to assess appropriateness. And appropriateness in the medium basically comes down to, are they distracted by the tech, so they end up just spinning gears because they can't focus on like the contents of therapy? Are we having too many interruptions in our internet connection and that we can't fix because it's just something inherent about the way we connect, such that we just can't get any progress done? is the online disinhibition effect, which is a whole sort of psychological concept proposed by John Suler back in the 90s about what happens when we're not in the same physical location interacting with each other. So it heavily arises on the internet, including in video conferencing. Is the online disinhibition effect actually toxic and interruptive to this client? Because for other clients, it can actually be very assistive to therapy. It can really help them do therapy. Such as people with anxiety may, through that disinhibition, be able to actually discuss their feelings with less anxiety. Whereas if you had to face them in the office, they would shut down and be unable to discuss. Whereas others may become so distracted or so sort of dissociated from the context that they're grinding gears or slipping gears because you can't get them to get into that sweet spot of anxiety where they can actually make change. They keep avoiding the difficult material and you can't get them to change because they can utilize the distance from you as a reason to dissociate and not get involved. All right, here I'm giving a real quick overview of that whole concept. But the idea there is, I keep that in mind. If you have in mind the idea that the person may not be appropriate for the context, and remember that the distance provided by the telecontext is something that allows for greater dissociation from your direct relationship with them. So they may be more disinhibited. They may be more willing to, or their transference, for example, may be more intense or feel more real to them because you're in a box. You really could be whatever they want you to be, right? Or the distance makes them more less inhibited around saying rude things or doing big things like that. However, that can also make them less disinhibited around saying what they're thinking and engaging their imagination, right? And the fact that they can make you what they want you to be may actually be pivotal to a successful therapy outcome. Like in my case, I had a client who had a very successful treatment and at the end discovered that I'm just so you know, I'm like 6'4", I'm a very big person, right? If she knew that, she would have just walked right out before we even started therapy. But she imagined me as being a very small person, even though I'm there's no particular reason. She imagined me being like 5'2". There's no particular reason to think of me either way, honestly, right? I'm just a talking head. So she made me a very small, slight person that she can overpower in her head, and that allowed it to work. And it was very successful, right? And then she was actually said, okay, I'm going to go back to in-person with a male therapist, and I don't care how big he is. It's like, awesome. Yeah, big win for online disinhibition effect, right? So that's a big thing to look out for when you're doing this work, is the appropriateness of the context. The better you are at understanding and managing online disinhibition effect, and the better you are at helping with the tech issues as well, that can be there too, the less likely you are to have appropriateness issues. However, you got to monitor it. And the standard of care is that you monitor it, and if it's not working, you try to help the client find something else. And so because you're doing that, make sure you tell the person ahead of time that you're doing that. Make sure the informed consent includes that we're going to make sure this is working for you. And if it's not, we're going to try to find something else. And I think to me, it's really far better if you can enroll the client in that process. Right? Because if you can get them thinking about it too, then not only does it not blindside them, but also they're more likely to put the energy into making up the difference and fixing what doesn't work for them. Because that's like I was saying earlier, when you're doing tele, the client needs to be a little bit more involved in their own care, which includes an awareness of the things that could be therapy interfering inherent in the medium you're using. When clients are aware that they have a role to play there, they're more likely to work or think hard about how to make up that difference and ensure that the medium works better for them. Or at least talk to you about how, this isn't really working, and therefore you can then have a conversation with them about that. And maybe the conversation itself can help you start engaging those gears and making things work. All right. So that's one of the many reasons why you want to enroll clients in the whole process of the process, the meta process of tele, much more than you would need to when they come to your space where you set everything up for them. All right, so go to the checklist, look up for some other informed consent items. At that point, they're much more logistical and easy to understand. So go ahead and check that out in the checklist. Oh no, I just did the thing. Okay. All right, jurisdictions. All right, go ahead and type in the chat or somewhere else. What's the main job of a licensing board? Is a licensing board there to help us, succeed? Is the licensing board there to provide continuing education? Like, what's the verb? Or is the job of a licensing board to regulate us, to protect the public from harmful members of the profession, and to help ensure that protect the public? Exactly. Yeah, Nancy's got it, right? And I actually spoke with one of the members of the psychology licensing board after one of my presentations, and she said it's protect the public, but it's also to make sure that the quality of care that comes from the profession meets a certain standard. And I was like, that's actually very important, especially in the current, especially right now with PsyPact being a big thing and Oregon deciding not to join the PsyPact, which that informs us of the reasons of why the Oregon Psychology Board has not joined PsyPact. Which, if you don't know what that is, I can explain it right now because it's jurisdictions time. So here's the basic principle when it comes to dealing with jurisdictions. Basically, licensing boards, the job of a licensing board is to protect the public from bad actors in our profession, right? Or professions. Sorry, I'm a counselor, you're a psychologist, right? So at that point, what that means is they have to figure out how they're going to do that. And generally, the way they do that in the United States follows the old medical model, which in this case works very well for us, I think, which is you have to be permitted by that board to practice in the jurisdiction that they cover, right? And so the way they do it for our professions is licensure, because psychologists are professionals, right? So the way you do that is you license them, because psychologists have a wide array of independent practice rights and privileges when they are licensed. And so a license is something that you have to upkeep and you have to protect, right? So if someone wants to say, okay, cool, I have a client in Oregon, I would like to practice psychology with that person, and that psychologist is, say, I don't know, in Florida, and that's where they're licensed, the Oregon Licensing Board goes, you've not done our process. Like you've not done the things that we do to vet people before they start working with the consumers that we protect, the public we protect. And the question is, who's the public that they protect? It is anyone physically present in Oregon. And I'm gonna say that again, because the details on that are super vital. They protect anyone who's physically present in Oregon, right? So for example, if you've got clients who live in Vancouver, Washington, like I do, right? And they just cross the bridge and come down to Portland, now they're in Oregon. That means the Oregon Psychology Board governs all psychological practices that involve that person while they're physically in Oregon. Even if literally all they're doing is going to Jansen Beach to buy a car. Like if that's the entire thing they're doing, if you like talk to them and do like a phone session while they're in Jansen Beach, maybe you would, right? You are under Oregon jurisdiction and you are not licensed by the Oregon board. And therefore that is a violation of Oregon law. So I want to make sure, the reason they give that example is to say, because often the counter questions that come up are, what if it's a kid going to college? It's like, same thing, their feet are in whatever state the college is in, right? And often what people wonder about there is like, but they're not a resident of that state. They're a resident of my state, right? Residency does not affect it. It's not residency. It's not even intention. It's not even like how long they plan to be there. It's like where their feet are at the moment you're working. So for example, if I'm doing a session with a client who's in a car, like a moving car, like I probably would avoid that, but it could certainly happen, right? For good reasons. And they're going up 205 and they get onto the bridge. And as soon as they hit the middle of the Columbia River, they're in Washington, and it's now, what I'm doing is now illegal in Washington because I'm not licensed there. Yeah, what's up? Oh, sorry, I heard somebody talking.
Oh.
Oh, okay.
I'm in the wrong place.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I will get to the right place.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye. Okay, so the thing is, some states, because basically, I think a thing that's really important to remember about this is that this is not what's good for the clients. Public health is not improved by it becoming illegal to work with your therapist just if you step across the river. Well, drive across the river, right? Like that doesn't make things better. That's not good for health. The reason for this state of affairs is not because it's the good thing or that research says this is the best way to do it. The reason for this state of affairs is just how our systems work. That's the entire reason, right? Just our systems are way behind the reality of telehealth. And the fact that being able to make sure continuity of care exists through tech is extremely feasible, but through law and politics, it is not yet feasible. Or at least not as feasible as it is through the tech. That's the entire reason. So if it's frustrating or seems wrong, understand that that means you probably understand it fine, right? That does not mean it's wrong, or that doesn't mean you're thinking of it wrong or that you're getting it wrong. It means you're probably getting it right, to be honest. So for psychologists, there is a big thing called the PSI-Pact, which is a compact between various states, wherein you basically have to go through a big rigmarole to register with the PSI-Pact. But once you do, you can then actually practice telepsychology freely between all the states that are members of the PSI-Pact. Like that is probably the kind of solution we'll see in every profession for dealing with this problem. There will probably almost certainly not be any universal licensure. Instead, what there will be is compacts between states that allow a person's license to extend to those states. Oregon has decided not to join the PSI-Pact, and it's been come up several times. When I talked to my friend on the psychology board, her concern is that there are a number of states that are in the PSI-Pact where their requirements for getting a psychology license are much lower than Oregon's requirements, such as a requirement for residency being one of them. So Oregon has a higher standard for licensure than some other states. Those states are in the PSI-Pact, and so therefore the psychologists who have that lower training standard, if Oregon joined the PSI-Pact, those folks with the lower training standard would still be allowed to then practice in Oregon, practically without limit, even though everyone else who lives in Oregon is licensed in Oregon had to meet a higher standard, right? And that's the kind of conflict we're going to see a lot. Like that's generally what we're going to see get in the way of more interstate compacts. My profession, counseling, also has a compact that just fired up and it's moving really fast. And I imagine the same kind of conflict arising all over the place, right? But somehow overcoming that is how we're going to overcome this issue of access to care. Just FYI, this is the way it is. Okay, there are a lot of states where, if you're a licensed clinician and your client travels to their state, they will give you temporary permission to practice, right? So if a client goes out of state, all is not lost. It is possible that you can actually temporarily work with that person under the laws of that state. How do you find out? Well, you look up the laws of that state when your client goes there. Man, that sounds like a pain in the butt. Okay, so I have a resource for you. This is personcenteredtech.com. This is my company, just so you know. The thing I'm going to show you is a free resource. If you go to resources and go down to 50 state tool, we do our best to keep this updated in real time. Click the state where your client is going. So for example, I'm in Portland, so I'm very oriented on Washington because it's just across the river, right? So if we go to Washington, let's see what Person-Centered Tech currently knows about temporary practice in Washington. Oh, look, how convenient. Yes, psychologists do have some temporary practice permission in Washington. But you want to find out details about that. Like apparently it's 90 days, which is very typical of temporary practice. It's going to be a certain number of days. Often it's 30, 60, or 90 days. And that doesn't mean like continuously. That just means, usually what that means is if you see a client on one day who is in Washington, you've used one of your days. And then if you see him again a week later, you've used one of your days, which means that 90 days is probably long enough that if you have like one client who goes to Washington, you can probably continue their care pretty much indefinitely. 90 days is plenty of time in the temporary practice context. However, remember to definitely look it up. The yes is linked to somewhere. So there's, you have to apply for a temporary permit. That's what it is. Okay. Right, so there's lots of different ways the states do that. Sometimes you have to apply for a temporary permit. And so that's why this is linked on our table, because you need to go make that application. But man, they give you 90 days. That's a lot of time. So it's totally worth the permit if you have a practice or a client who's moved to Washington. And down here, you always want to scroll down and look at the specifics before you just believe what our table says. And make sure you link, like these also will have links to rules and laws in that foreign state. Because if you're working with a client, and thanks, Jeff, if you're working with a client in a foreign state, you need to follow the rules of that state, the laws of that state, right? So if they have any special laws, especially about telehealth, it'd be a really good idea to know about them. For the example I like to use is the Arizona Counseling Board, because I'm a counselor, I'm an LPC. Like the Arizona Counseling Board has a rule in the books that says that when you do telehealth in Arizona, one of the things you must document in the session note is the address of the person, like where the address of where the person was during the session. By the way, it's a good idea to do that anyways. It's a really good idea to do that no matter where you are practicing. Like write down the address of the client during the session. But it's required by law in Arizona. I haven't seen it required by law anywhere else. So Arizona, by the way, gives very generous temporary practice allowance. So like Arizona counselors, I'm a counselor, I get it. Oh, it's not saying how long it is, but counselors I think have like 60 days or 90 days, like this enormously long amount of time for temporary practice in Arizona. But while my client is there, if I don't document their address, I'll be violating Arizona law. Right? Now, whether that's going to come up or not, it's very unlikely to come up, right? But if it did, if for some reason it came up that Arizona needed to see my records for when I was working with that client, they would know, hey, you're not following our telehealth laws, right? So just having temporary practice permission doesn't mean you don't have to follow the laws of that state. So it could be a good idea to go look up and see if there's any particularly glaring thing you need to know about the telehealth rules where the client is before you go ahead and jump into work, especially if you have to apply for a temporary permit, which apparently you do in Washington, right? So just so you know, once again, this is not sane in the sense of it fits together well, right? This is not sane. It just is what it is, right? And because it's an issue of the law, be aware that the impact on you can be very significant if it goes awry. A couple of risk management things to point out. A friend of mine is an attorney and a counselor points out quite frequently, if a client is in another state and you are not legally allowed to work there, but you work there anyways, which happens a lot. I don't want to beat around the bush. That happens all the time, that people will work illegally across state lines with their clients all the time. If you do so, your liability insurance will not cover that. So yeah, see your faces, right, exactly, right? So if something goes awry and you need to fall back on your malpractice insurance, they'll be like, you were practicing illegally. We can't cover you. We only cover legal practice. And the other thing to consider there then is, let's say that something happens, like the client, let's say they complete suicide or they get into a terrible accident and for some reason that leads to needing to know who the therapist on record was, that kind of thing. Let's say the family sues at that point, or sues for they sue for malpractice. And the suit takes place in the state where they were when you did the thing they claim was malpractice, which is this foreign state. And so at that point, they go to the judge, well, the first thing we need to demonstrate for malpractice is that they were not licensed. They were practicing illegally. The most basic fundamental aspect of professional practice is that you are doing so legally. Case closed, you lose. That's the idea, right? So that doesn't, by the way, I want to let you know, I'm a very risk management oriented person. You make your decisions as to what that means to you for what you need to do with your clients. But I really want to make sure you know about those potential risks and consequences. Right? Okay, I did not just like endorse practicing across state lines illegally. I totally did not just do that. But I certainly want to make sure you know what the risks of doing that are. And I only have like 2 minutes left, so I can't get to everything. But let me. But someone asked about VPNs and such. So let me take the last couple of minutes to talk a bit about tech. And the older populations that can go together. Okay, so let me jump into here. Or no, that's not where that is. Do we have that in there? No. Okay. Oh, okay. In general, when you use a service to help you run your practice or to like connect you to clients, that service is essentially working in your practice, right? So Zoom, the company Zoom, is involved in this conference. The company Zoom, if you use Zoom with your clients, which you may very well be doing, the company Zoom is involved in your delivery of care. And so we can't just use any old random service. We have to use a service that's appropriate for our usage, because the service will maintain all of our legal and ethical standards, including for security and privacy, right? So when you use a service to deliver care, that service needs to perform a business associate agreement with you. Now, here's where we get to the working with the elderly, and mostly I'm just about to express a frustration point, but so one thing that's happening during the public health emergency is that the HIPAA people, the Office of Civil Rights, is essentially waiving the need for business associate agreements. Like, you can use the free version of Zoom, you can use FaceTime, you can even use Facebook Messenger video to do your telehealth sessions right now. And the OCR, the HIPAA people, will look the other way. They've put out a statement very clearly saying they will not enforce, right? And that's cool. But however, the thing that's most useful about that is, to me, is that means we can use FaceTime. And I'm going to tell you right now, FaceTime is one of the best solutions you have for working with elderly clients who are not tech savvy. And a lot of people I know who work with elderly have often commented, like, they're so glad they can use FaceTime because someone just has to hand the client an iPad or an iPhone, usually an iPad, you want a bigger screen. Right? They just need to hand them an iPad, and then all the clinician has to do is call them, and the person just answers, and now they're connected. Because that's how FaceTime works. You know, if you get a FaceTime call, it just looks like you're getting a phone call, and you just say, answer the phone call, and then boom, now you're video connected. And that's great. And FaceTime is actually very good video software. Unfortunately, when this health emergency ends and there's no longer the waiver for business associates, it'll no longer be compliant or legal to use FaceTime. And I'll tell you, I cannot think of an alternative that does the same thing, you know, that has helped the same way. And that's because of the nature of the fact that FaceTime is like built into your machine. It's like built into your iPad or built into your iPhone. So we can't replace it with something else. VPNs are great. VPNs do not impact whether or not a software option is compliant. You always need the business associate agreement, no matter what, because even if you use a VPN, the data is still going through their computers. A VPN, I'm like, ooh, how do I explain a VPN really fast? A VPN, okay, I'm gonna use the analogy. Our popular habits for use of devices, the way we use devices, is very similar to like how people had sex in the 70s. Like, there was just a whole lot of like highly promiscuous, unprotected sex, right? And the way we are using our devices these days is like that, but like times 10. We are constantly using our devices in ways that are really, really dangerous for the device, for the security of our data and for the device. We'll just connect to random little Wi-Fi networks that hackers are sitting on and being like, I'm waiting for you to connect so I can give you a virus. Here, have a virus. There's lots of that going on. What a VPN is it's a service you can run on all your stuff, on your phone, on your tablet, on your computer. That's essentially like wearing a condom all the time. And I use the term condom because it's like a protective layer, right? That's why I use the term condom, the gendered one, right? Because there's going to be gendering there. So like the VPN basically gives you like a secure iron tunnel past all the schmutz directly to the VPN service that you use. And VPN service, so it's a monthly cost, but they're not expensive. So the services we like, I'll just give you one just for simplicity. We really like Tunnel Bear. There we go. Because it's got a cute bear. But also it does all the things you want. Basically, like if you decide to set up a VPN, which is not a bad idea, the reason you would use a VPN is it would allow you to use like Starbucks Wi-Fi or your neighbor's Wi-Fi or just Wi-Fi that you can't guarantee the security of. Like if you haven't had a tech person guarantee your home Wi-Fi, using a VPN would be a nice, fast, just sort of, you know, slap it on kind of way of bypassing the need to make it more secure. Right? Tunnel Bear is great because there's two things you want with your VPN. You want it to be zero logging, which all legitimate VPNs are zero logging, but some of them are not. And it needs to have a thing called a kill switch, which the kill switch is a thing where if the VPN fails for some reason, it will shut down your internet connection. Basically, it's like a last ditch safety switch that the software has that makes sure your device doesn't get invaded. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I know I'm just gonna finish talking about VPNs and I'm gonna go. Sorry, I should have said something. Thanks, Jeff. Like, that's the idea. So if you get Tunnel Bear, there's a setting in Tunnel Bear called Vigilant Bear. That's the kill switch. You want to turn that on. All right. Once again, that does not make your software HIPAA friendly, but it does make the security of your internet connection secure and HIPAA friendly. All right, that's what that would do. Okay. All right. I think I've addressed all the questions, and I want to address Jeff's anxiety to make sure you all can get lunch. Thank you all for joining me. Apologies for not being able to do all of the material, but I really hope what we did so far was helpful. And I'll stick around for a few minutes for people who want to ask questions or chat, but otherwise, Jeff's got the code for this presentation, and thank you all for joining me.